Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more. The Autobiography of a Freedom Writer. We'll be finishing up the chapter we've been reading here. So yeah, let's go ahead and hop into this. The Freedom Ride almost ended after the attack in Birmingham, until a second group of students, mostly from the Nashville sit-ins, came in to replace the first group. The FBI, meanwhile, provided no protection for the riders. The second wave of riders left Birmingham on May the 15th. At the terminal in Montgomery, they too were viciously attacked as they stepped off the bus. Several were chased into the streets and into other buildings, so they sought cover. Somehow they managed to get back on the bus and continue their ride. The next stop would be in Jackson, Mississippi. For what had seemed like a month leading up to this point, as if expecting an invasion, officials in our state began what I call the big lie. They wanted the world to think that they intended to treat the arriving Freedom Riders with the greatest amount of professionalism and courtesy. The unspoken truth was that they thought they would teach the riders a lesson. Mississippi is ready, declared John Wright, head of the White Citizens Council in Jackson. At the same time, other officials were said to be informing the U.S. Justice Department that all the Freedom Riders would be killed if they came to Mississippi. As a student body at Tougaloo, we were not going to let that happen without a fight. That same night, Governor Ross Barnett appeared on TV telling everyone, "The Negroes in Mississippi are satisfied with the conditions here." That made me furious. I rejected the idea that the lives of black Mississippians should be confined to second-class citizenship. Witnessing the horrific attacks on the riders made me realize I had to get more deeply involved with the freedom struggle. I had to let the world know that most citizens of Mississippi were tired of being at the bottom of the economic and education ladders. Blacks were tired of inferior schools and housing conditions. They were tired of not being hired to make enough money to feed our children. I wanted to send a message to Governor Barnett. You are wrong in your assessment of the black citizens of Mississippi. The Freedom Ride arrives, the first Freedom Ride arrives in Mississippi. The first group of Freedom Riders arrived at the bus station in Jackson on the 2nd of June, where they were met by a horde of policemen. There was no violence, though we at Tougaloo felt the riders were not safe. In an ironic twist, two of the police dogs used by the Jackson Police Department, Happy and Rebel, were trained by Harry North of Springfield, Missouri, the former Nazi stormtrooper who trained Killer Doberman to guard Adolf Hitler's airports. As soon as the riders stepped off the bus and walked into the bus station, crossing the color line in the waiting room, they were almost immediately arrested and carted off to local jails. Students at Tougaloo were taking in all of these events as we continued our classes and crossed fingers and hopeful hearts. One of our prayers was, "Let the riders survive their stay in jail." A small group of us, maybe 10 or 12, kept track of the number of riders who had been injured and taken to the hospital along the way. and we checked regularly for details about their whereabouts. We knew that we were expecting 27 Freedom Riders. Therefore, we wanted to make sure that 27 arrived in Jackson. We were glued to radio and television for any type of information we could get on them. We were prepared to take action to help them. Shortly after the Freedom Riders had been booked into jail in Jackson, they appeared in court. They were quickly found guilty of breach of peace and sentenced to 60 days in the state's maximum security prison known as Parchman Farm, Mississippi's ultimate humiliation. The prison houses death row inmates and is located on a 21,000-acre farm. CORE called for other civil rights organizations to support a Jail No Bail initiative aimed to fill all of the jails in Mississippi. That's when hundreds of people from around the country began to board buses bound for Jackson. After the first group of riders were arrested and jailed in Mississippi, another group came in, then another, and another. By the end of November, as many as 406 Freedom Riders had come into the state. Almost daily, the newspapers ran editorials and politicians made speeches claiming all the trouble in Mississippi is being caused by outside agitators. They ignored the fact that they were Freedom Riders who were native-born Mississippians. The segregation fathers had overlooked the June 2nd, 1961 arrest of Leslie Word, a black male Freedom Rider from Corinth, Mississippi, because he came into Jackson on a Freedom bus from Montgomery. The arrest on July 24th, 1961 of James Bevel, a CORE activist, born in Itabana, Mississippi, did not count. Bevel was considered an outsider since he was a student attending American Baptist Theological Seminary in Nashville. Those of us who had been engaging in acts of protest in Mississippi were eager to start a larger movement of our own. However, the reality was that we did not have a plan. Our NAACP base had the reality was that, our NAACP base had limited legal counsel and money for bail bonds to support the number of people who would be required to risk arrest. We were filled with hope and anticipation as CORE and SNCC began to accelerate the movement for civil rights, taking it out of the courtroom and into the streets. The 1961 Freedom Rides formed the backdrop to a dramatic interplay among CORE, SNCC, and the NAACP, state and federal government, the press, and the public. These interactions brought ideas, power, courage, and unity to the movement while accentuating the conflicts that would eventually sunder the fragile alliance of civil rights organizations. It is true that the NAACP did not particularly care for the Freedom Rider tactic, but even so, one NAACP officer did not always adhere to all of the organization's policy. When Ella Baker felt the NAACP's methods were taking too long to produce results, she and her followers decided another organization was needed. They wanted to develop an organization that was deeply rooted in religion and free to take independent action against the segregated system. Thus, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, was formed. Similarly, Ella determined that the role of young people needed to be defined within the framework of SCLC. It was decided that yet another organization, especially for youth, was needed. The implement and lead to implement and lead the new organization. James Lawson, who had been associated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and a member of CORE, was chosen. He had been conducting nonviolent workshops at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. His new trainees included Bernard Lafayette, Marion Barry, James Bevel, Diane Nash, John Lewis, and others who became the Nashville Group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Tougaloo 4 leads Mississippi Freedom Riders. The SNCC leaders, James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette, both original Freedom Riders, were released soon after their arrest in Jackson. They came over to our campus to organize a meeting for recruiting people to continue the rides to New Orleans. I had met Bevel earlier that day and I helped to set up the meeting. We had discussed the training and possibility of my joining the rides. Later at the meeting, when Bevel called for volunteers to continue the rides, I spoke of my desire to support the effort and of the need for Mississippi Freedom Riders. When Bevel asked me, well, what are you going to do about it? Will you volunteer to become a Freedom Rider? I agreed. I found it amazing that only 2 Tougaloo students volunteered straight away. Mary Harrison, a 20-year-old Asian American from San Antonio, Texas, and myself, then a 19-year-old sophomore. But we wouldn't be alone for long. And that ends that chapter. So, yeah. So, we see a lot of the effects of the freedom rides. Now, and we see the other groups that take part in helping to set it up. You know, Armstrong mentions his work in the NAACP. He talks about the SNCC, the SCLC, CORE, and many, they're the same groups we've heard if you listen to any of my Dr. King videos. It's the ones he often mentions: SNCC, SCLC, CORE, NAACP, you know, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. These organizations play a huge part, and we see a lot of how they were involved in the history. And then he also mentioned some names we may recognize. I don't know if it's the same John Lewis, but there was a John Lewis who took part in many of the freedom rides and protests, who later became a legislator in the U.S. Congress. Let's see. Yeah, John Lewis. He also mentions Marion Barry. I don't know if it's the same one that was the mayor of D.C. or not. Again, there's several people with the same names, so we can't guarantee it's the same people. But yeah, um, it's interesting. But I'm going to go ahead and end this episode there. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, later.